Okay, we should have the meeting being recorded. Welcome everyone to the, I think it's May 28th iteration of the MicroProfile Live Hangout. The meeting minutes are in the chat. As is usual, it's everyone's shared responsibility to take notes during the meeting. And today we have special guest stars from the Eclipse Foundation, Paul Buck and Mike Milinkovich. But Kevin, you have this as your kind of item, so you want to go ahead and introduce the topic?
Sure. And John, just to let you know, I still don't have co-host, so I can't help with muting noisy phones or anything.
All right, yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm not sure why I can't make you co-host, so we'll have to figure that out some other day. All right, thanks.
Okay. So what this agenda item was for, you know, I'm involved with Jakarta EE. I'm involved with MicroProfile. I've been talking with Mike at, you know, on these calls, at conferences, privately, trying to, I guess, trying to figure out the specification process that we have defined with the Eclipse Foundation, and how can it or should it apply to the MicroProfile efforts. And I think it, you know, I started to introduce this a couple of times before, but we always ended up with more questions than I could answer. So I think it was best to bring Mike in. So Mike Milinkovich is the head of the foundation. I don't know what your exact title is if you're president of the foundation. I'll let you do your own little introduction there, but Mike is in charge of the foundation. And so he's going to bring forward the Eclipse Foundation specification process and what it could mean to the MicroProfile project. And then one thing that I would ask is that we allow Mike to do his introduction and explanation of the relationship between the Eclipse Foundation specification process and MicroProfile, and then we will open it up for questions. So take note of your questions as he's speaking, and then we'll do a group discussion afterwards. So Mike, go ahead.
All right, well, thanks for the introduction, both John and Kevin. And yeah, I guess for the record, my title is Executive Director, which is, I guess, the what they sort of the president or CEO title that they use when it's a nonprofit or a not-for-profit. So thanks for the opportunity, and thanks everyone for taking the time. Looks like there's already quite a few people on the call, so that's great. And so I guess my motivation for being here and having this chat is to sort of lay out what I sort of see as some requirements. I think we're sort of at a bit of a meta level at the moment. This is sort of like there's a set of requirements that I think that we need to get in place from the Eclipse Foundation's perspective, and there are a lot of details that can be worked out later, and there are many degrees of freedom here. So I'm not here to say this is a particular solution. I'm sort of here to explore a problem space and to perhaps, if it's appropriate, give a couple of ideas on things that we could do moving forward. And so to start off from a requirements perspective, there's a couple of key points that I'd like to sort of lay out the territory. And so to start off with, it's a bit of a sort of a, and a lot of this has to do with legal stuff, unfortunately. Very little of this is about making developers more productive. This is about, to a certain degree, this is about making adopters of the technology more productive. And we all come from an open source background where focusing on making it easy for developers to move things forward is the key measure of success. But in the case of, in the world of specifications and standards, it's actually a little bit different. And part of that goes to the licensing regime. So open source and open standards, or I'm going to use open standards and open specifications interchangeably here, but there are some subtle differences. But in the case of open source versus open standards, We're all familiar with open source licenses, and the wording in the Eclipse license and the Apache license are almost identical, and basically says that when you contribute something to a project under one of those licenses, if there's any patents involved, there's a royalty-free license to those patents to that contribution. As of the moment that contribution goes into the collective work, though it doesn't use the phrase collective work. And in the case of open standards, the patent licensing regimes are typically very, very different, and they're much broader in the sense that the patent licenses are granted are to the entire specification and to all downstream implementers and users of that specification. So the patent licenses end up being far broader than what we're used to in the open source world. And as a result, the companies, particularly the big companies that have large patent portfolios, are much more cautious about their engagement in specification organizations. And there's then sort of related to that, because the emphasis here is really on patents as opposed to, say, copyrights or trademarks or other forms of intellectual property. Over the decades that the computer industry has been around, and it's really 50 or 60 years at most, there's been a large body of expertise that has been built up over those decades around constructing specification processes that protect their participants and adopters from bad actors. So there are cases in the past where an organization has inserted ideas into a specification, and those ideas are covered by patents which are owned by the organization. And what that ended up causing was, every company that's involved that later on adopts the specification is a potential licensee to those patents, and of course, then there's patent royalties that are associated with it. And a lot of what was perceived as complexity in open standards goes to a body of knowledge that's grown up over these past decades around how to prevent these bad actors from doing something like this. And so now, how does this really affect the Eclipse MicroProfile? So when Eclipse MicroProfile was first started, the Eclipse Foundation specification process did not exist. I can literally remember sitting down for a breakfast in San Francisco at what was then called Java 1 with some folks from Tommy Tribe, IBM, and Red Hat, and they said, hey, can we do specs at Eclipse? And I'm like, yeah, sure, sounds like it should be simple. But as we wrote and worked on the Eclipse Foundation spec process for almost a year, we learned a lot ourselves as an institution, and to the people that were involved, they also learned a lot. And we actually have done a lot of work in our IP policy, in our website terms of use, in the committer agreements, the contributor agreements, to ensure the maximum protection for the people that are participating in specs, the adopters of these specs, and the Eclipse Foundation itself. So we've learned a lot, and we've done a lot over the past really a full year of work, at least in putting all this together. And then the other part of this is that when Eclipse MicroProfile first started, it was obviously a very, it was relatively small, and who knew if it was going to work out. And here we are about 2 years since the project, a little bit more than 2 years since the project was started, and it's a roaring success. So there's at least 7 or 8 independent implementations that are out there. There's been our own developer survey shows that the developers are very interested in it, and the interest in it and the use of it and adoption of it has been extraordinary. But that great success means that there's a greater set of responsibilities on all of us, and in particular, the Eclipse Foundation itself as the organization behind these specs, to make sure that we get these, the I's dotted and T's crossed done correctly, to make sure that we're protecting, the Eclipse Foundation and the people that are building implementations of these specs in their products. And I guess the last thing I'll mention from the requirement side is that we've actually gone over this sort of where we are with MicroProfile and how it's progressed and how it's been so successful with our lawyer. And he has pointed out that there is potential liability here down the road if there was a bad actor. I mean, I think realistically we have to the odds might be small, but of something like that happening, but the downside risk could be pretty dramatic if we get it wrong. So there's certainly some motivation from our side to use the Eclipse Foundation spec process and use the good work that's been put into it over the past year, and to help protect the licensees of these specs in their independent implementations, and create the kind of high quality specs from a legal perspective that we are trying to generate from other places like Jakarta. Now, in terms of how this would actually happen, there's several different approaches on the table, and I don't really think I have a particularly strong feeling about one way or the other. But for example, one is that we create a separate MicroProfile working group. Obviously the MicroProfile project has been around for a while, and but we've never actually formalized it as a working group. Using the Eclipse Foundation spec process does require a working group. So one possibility is we set up a unique one. Another possibility, which might have the advantage of less paperwork for pretty much everybody involved, would be to create a second specification committee under the auspices of the Jakarta working group, or the Jakarta EE working group, and keep MicroProfile with its own process, but piggyback on top of all of the paperwork that's already been done to set up the Jakarta EE working group. So those are like some ideas on how solutions could be found. It's not really the point of this conversation at the moment. It's more about just kind of setting the table on why I think the status quo does need to change. And we can obviously talk about the details of what that how that could unfold going forward. So I think with that, I'll stop for the moment and maybe ask Kevin and John if that was sort of enough of an introduction to get to the questions, or if there's specific. I'll give you guys first shot at asking me some questions to make sure that if I didn't cover something that you thought needed covering, that we can answer those first.
Yeah, no, I think you covered the topics that need to be discussed. I guess I'll just kind of be a little.
Sorry to interrupt, Kevin. Actually, Paul Buckby is sitting beside me. Just pointed out there is one thing I forgot to mention, which is I think in the minds of some people, it's not obvious that the Eclipse Foundation specification process is customizable and is meant to be as a template. So I think in the minds of some, there's they conflate the Jakarta spec process with the Eclipse Foundation spec process, which is actually not the case. The EFSP was originally designed to be as light a weight and overlay on top of the Eclipse development process, which MicroProfile is already using, as possible. And so, one concrete example is that the default in the for the review periods in the EFSP is 7 days, whereas if memory serves me correctly, the Jakarta process decided they wanted to make most of them 28 days. So 21. That's 21 days. Sorry, that's just one example. That's just one example of the kinds of customizations that can be done to the EFSP.
Okay, so Paul did a good job of priming you, because that was a topic I was going to bring up. Just to explain the difference so that everyone on the call knows that there is a difference between the Jakarta EE specification process and the Eclipse Foundation specification process. And as kind of prep for this call, I personally just went through both of them to try to compare to what we currently do with MicroProfile. And we definitely map much closer to the Eclipse Foundation specification process than the Jakarta one. And the main problem is what Mike just pointed out, is the Jakarta one has a much longer review period for every one of their required reviews. And it wouldn't map to what we are trying to do with 3 releases per year. So that's the thing that I wanted to point out. So thanks.
Yeah, I have a quick question. If MicroProfile adopt the Eclipse Foundation spec process, so we can keep the org Eclipse.MicroProfile package as it is, right? What's the, yeah, okay. So
you could if you wanted to, and depending what you, yes. So the short answer is yes.
That is great. I think that's that's helped a lot. Okay, thank you. So by the way, it's like if personally, I would like to find out more about this kind of the process and etc. So it's basically the link EFSP. That's kind of what Kevin said. That's closer is closer to what MicroProfile should adopt, right? The project steps, EFSP. So that link in this minutes, right? That link, this minutes is kind of a generic template. And if we start with our MicroProfile specification, like a specification process, we will just take this as a template, and then we can add customize it for MicroProfile.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few additional items that we still need to figure out as a community, because like Mike pointed out, we would have to become part of some working group. We would need some specification committee, and then that specification committee is what would define the specification process for MicroProfile. So there's still work that would need to be done, but I think I might be putting words in our mouth, but I think we would be basing it off of the Eclipse Foundation specification process and not the Jakarta specification process.
Right. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to point out that, one thing that's always kind of been lingering at the back of my mind, and I think we've even talked about it during iterations of this call in the past, is that, when someone becomes a committer to MicroProfile, they can commit to any spec they want, right? They basically have free reign, and to this point, that hasn't been a problem. In MicroProfile, we tend to not pre-optimize our process, but at some point, I think we would have to think about splitting specs into different projects, just I think to deal with breaking out the committers across the projects. But I thought I would just bring that up. There's a side benefit to it.
Yeah, but from my perspective, I consider that orthogonal to the topic of the Eclipse Foundation spec process.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Okay, so there's a couple of questions here in the chat that I could answer if we've gotten to that point.
Yep, that's what I was going to point you to.
Okay, so the first question is, why isn't the Eclipse contributor agreement that we sign enough? The answer is the ECA is necessary but not sufficient. So the ECA, basically all the ECA says is that you are contributing, you are agreeing that you are contributing to an open source project in Eclipse Foundation under the license of that project. However, what the EFSP adds to that is a set of steps and processes by which those contributions can be turned into a specification document, which is licensed under the Eclipse Foundation specification license, and the TCKs are made under the TCK license, the Eclipse Foundation TCK license. Our Eclipse Foundation specification license is based on the W3C license, which is a very permissive version of what a spec license looks to. And what it specifically says, and this is what's missing from both the Eclipse license and the Apache license, what it specifically says is that you are authorized to create independent implementations in software based on these specifications. And it's that independent implementation part that helps with the licensing. But moreover, the bigger part of the EFSP that matters that you don't currently get from the way MicroProfile is set up is that the corporate participants that are participating in MicroProfile, if it was under the EFSP, then, and I'm talking specifically about companies like IBM and Red Hat, their patent portfolios are thereby licensed to independent implementers, and that is currently not the case. So, and then we can, this is perhaps a good way to segue into another question, which is what sort of, what's some examples of some worst case scenarios? And so some worst case scenarios would be, under the current regime, somebody implements, let's say, config, and the config spec infringes a patent that is owned by some company and it starts suing people who implement config. Let's say that there was a equivalent patent that was owned by IBM that we could have said, well, we don't do it that way. We actually follow the IBM patent and we're covered by that. We would not have that defense under the way it's currently set up. Because there is no license from IBM's patent portfolio through the specification to independent implementations of the spec. That license path, which is typical of how most specs are done, is simply non-existent in the case of MicroProfile. So another worst case scenario is MicroProfile currently because it doesn't have a working group model, there is no formality around who is participating. So somebody who works for a company which owns a large patent portfolio that wants to insert IP into MicroProfile could, with an eye to then suing people down the road, could do so just by having some people show up with Gmail accounts, and we don't even ask them who they work for, and that might be a bit of a stretch because people get to know each other over time, but that kind of bad actor scenario is, if you speak with specification people, is the kind of scenario that they're most interested in avoiding or preventing.
Mark.
Okay. Actually, sorry. There's a good question here. I did not read anything about patents in the EFSL. Are you talking about a different license than I? That's a really good question. So the Eclipse Foundation spec license only licenses the copyrights to independent implementations. The license that you want to look at is the TCK license, and this stuff all hangs together. The TCK license is the path by which you can claim compatibility. And then the Eclipse Foundation IP policy is the document that says, if you are able to claim compatibility, legitimately claim compatibility, you get these patent grants. So I appreciate that it's a little bit more complicated than having everything in one license, but that is how it all hangs together at the moment.
Yeah, but I was asking about the license for the specification itself. Is the Eclipse Foundation specification license, right?
Yes, the Eclipse Foundation specification license is not the means by which you get the patent licenses. You get the patent licenses through the TCK license, because that's where, unless you run the TCK, you are not compatible.
Yeah, sure. But if let's say I personally contribute to a specification, then if I own some patents, I have to grant those patents over. Otherwise, Eclipse Foundation would never be able to grant patents which they do not own or do not have a license, which they can sub-license. And the Eclipse Foundation specification license doesn't talk about patents. So I can't see how, if I have a patent and I contribute to the specification, I would kind of give my grant to the Eclipse Foundation so that they can sub-license this grant to downstream consumers as a contributor.
I understand exactly. The way that it works is that when you join let's follow the example of what would happen in Jakarta. So if you were to contribute to a Jakarta specification, you would sign an individual, in your individual capacity, a participation agreement in the Jakarta working group. And that agreement contains in it the specification level patent grants. So in that agreement, it says if you are contributing to a spec and that spec goes final, any patents that you own are licensed to the specification to compatible implementations of the specification. So there's several different there's several different documents that work in here, and I realize that yes, this is somewhat complicated, but the reason why it was set up the way it's set up is sort of a separation of concerns, because if somebody is just doing open source at Eclipse in a project that's completely unrelated to specifications, then the committer agreements and the contributor agreements are sufficient, and we don't really want to ask them to sign up to licensing us more intellectual property than they need to. So that's why you have these different documents that kind of layer upon one another depending on what it is that you're doing. And that's similarly, the Eclipse Foundation specification process layers on top of the Eclipse Foundation development process. So it's a spec overlay on top of our normal open source development process,
which we already follow.
Yeah, but it restricts, this license restricts rights you usually have, because usually if you have some, let's say EPL or Apache license or MPL or something like that, you get a very broad range of downstream distribution rights. And the Eclipse Foundation specification license basically grants you fewer rights than those other licenses. So
sorry, that's simply incorrect.
Okay, how does it work?
You're correct in that if you just read the specification license, it provides less. Yes. However, the specification license plus the TCK license plus the participation agreement and the IP policy in totality provide far broader rights than Apache or Eclipse or Mozilla licenses.
I will need to go back to read the TCK license, to be honest. But the specification contributor license is just for the contributors, not for the consumers. The question for me is, how can we move from, we got all the contributions from GitHub and whatever, pull requests from the broad public under Apache license. And I'm not quite sure if this is compatible, or we would be legally able to move it to an Eclipse Foundation specification license project. And the other thing, is the Eclipse Foundation specification license OSI approved? Not the EPL, this is OSI approved, the Eclipse Foundation specification license.
No, it's not OSI approved because it's not an open source license.
Yeah, that's the point.
But you're missing the point.
Yeah, probably.
The point is that it's not just one document, but the totality of the licenses, when combined, provide far broader rights than any one open source license. Because in addition to being able to create derivative works, and in addition to so actually, let me back up a step. One of the things to understand is that when you were in a future world where MicroProfile was under the EFSP, the day-to-day contribution license for people working in the projects would continue to be the Apache license. So that does not change. And in the Apache license, there's a very nice patent-free royalty grants for those contributions. So the existing IP flows would continue to work exactly as they do today. In addition to those existing IP flows, the specification license, the TCK license, the participation agreement, and the IP policy, when combined, provides clearer patent grants to downstream independent implementers of the specifications. So this is in addition to, not in replace of.
So I apologize. I was just going to do a time check here. Technically, we had allotted 30 minutes to this, but since we have Mike on, I think it's good if we keep communicating here and keep having a conversation. I don't think we've necessarily hit a rat hole per se. I think we're getting clarifications back and forth. But is everyone else okay with moving forward with this discussion?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I kind of understand what Mike is the kind of the point. So basically, Mike, let's take an example for example MP config, and MicroProfile config and now is under Apache license version 2. Yep. So if we go through the process, in addition to the Apache license 2. And then in the API and the spec, we have Eclipse Foundation spec license, as well as the Apache license. And for TCK, we have Apache license plus this TCK license, right? Yep. So exactly. We don't need to do anything else. Presumably, when we add this Eclipse Foundation spec license, we just put another file. We say, okay, this is the Eclipse Foundation spec license. Do we need to go through any kind of review process and etc. To make sure, like, what we have done is comply with the rules under this license, or just we just directly put the file to say this is under Eclipse Foundation spec license.
So there would be a little bit of process, but it would be pretty similar to what you have now. So let's say when you're doing a release of config in MicroProfile right now, let's pretend you did it independently, just for simplicity. Right now, you say you're going to do a release review, and you work with Wayne, and the project does a release review, and then you're done. And the release review takes 7 days. In a spec process, it would be pretty much exactly the same thing. You would do a release review through the spec process, and the spec committee would vote on it over a 7-day period. And as long as 2/3 of the spec committee voted yes, then you're done. Then you would take the spec document and the TCK and relicense those from Apache into the spec license and TCK license. Perhaps put a binary of the TCK in a special place where people can download it and say, this is the one that you're going to run if you're going to legally claim compatibility. But then all of the additional features of those licenses would kick in, and patent protection would ensue. And I'm sure there's a sort of a question lurking in the background somewhere. I've lost track of where we are in the chat because it keeps scrolling. But one of the things to understand is that to date, the companies that have been involved in the MicroProfile process have only given patent grants under the Apache license. The first time you ran, a future version of MicroProfile through this process, let's say it was MicroProfile 4.0. When MicroProfile 4.0 went through the process, and when it comes out the other side, the companies which have signed up to participate in the process, like IBM, Red Hat, Tommy Tribe, Pyera, et cetera, their patents would at that point become licensed to MicroProfile, in addition to the previous license grants that have happened under the Apache license. So we're pretty confident that just basically taking MicroProfile and running it through the process is going to give us those additional license protections that we're striving for.
Okay,
So
sorry.
Okay, you know what, guys? Let
no,
me
go ahead, Emily.
something here. This is Amelia. What happens if MicroProfile decides not to do anything in 2019? Paul, Mike?
I don't know.
You know, one of the things that I am concerned about, and one of the things that I hear constantly, I was just in Japan, and there were more than 7 talks in Japanese and in English. And the Java conference, the biggest Java conference in Tokyo. And one of the coolest things that I heard from hundreds in the community is that MicroProfile enables anyone to join and feel that they don't need to be in a group and be told that they are important or be part of a committee to feel that they can contribute, say by writing a blog or by testing something, by sending a message, by sending a commit, a PR, an issue. It doesn't really matter. They don't feel small. One of the coolest things that I learned last week was also that these people that do not speak English now are creating Twitter accounts and are adding themselves to our group. It has more than 1,000 because we're that inclusive. I am concerned that by changing something at the moment that we have no problems with at all, we will deflect this growing community that is in Asia, that is just incredible, welcoming, and that is passionate about the MicroProfile project because we have made it so. Because we have no layers of complexity with, you have to pay, you have to sign, they have to sign just the 1 or 2 documents, and then they feel that they can add value. What I have learned with Jakarta is that we lacked transparency in the beginning. Now we're being more open. It's open source. Open source means the user and the contributor, the user is free to use it as they wish. Now we're saying that we're concerned about how the user will adapt MicroProfile. Isn't that totally different to what we mean open source? It's actually meant to be used by the world. And the coders and the contributors can be the same as the users, but now we're concerned that someone might sue us or sue the Eclipse Foundation. I'm extremely concerned that we will add something that doesn't work because we're having problems adapting new partners for Jakarta because of the complexity. And now you see, just can we talk about this?
All right,
so
Mike.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So the development, the day-to-day development flow for these projects doesn't have to change at all. So you were saying examples of people who wanted to write a blog post, people who wanted to do a pull request on GitHub, people who wanted to make a minor contribution to a spec. None of that changes. The only things that change is for the companies that want to get involved. There's more formality because they're going to be signing up their patent portfolios. And if for somebody who wants to become a full-fledged committer on one of the specifications, there's going to be one additional document that needs to be signed in addition to their committer agreement. So, well, actually, it's a different document because the individual participation agreement embeds the new committer agreement. But if you have somebody who today wanted to contribute 3 lines of text to a MicroProfile specification, they would, get a GitHub account, sign the Eclipse ECA, and can give you a pull request with those 3 lines. Absolutely none of that would change in the scenario I'm talking about. An individual who is doing that would do it exactly the same way. However, because if it was under the Eclipse Foundation spec process, just to give you a couple of examples of changes that happen. In this particular case, one of the important ones is that we actually updated our website terms of use to say that if you contribute to a spec project, an idea on a mailing list, for example, you cannot come back and sue us later for patent infringement or our licensees. So that's just an example of where the work that we did in terms of tying all of these documents together, because it's under the EFSP that that you get additional protections for downstream implementers and adopters and consumers. But the main point, Amelia, is I actually agree. You're right in that the last thing that we want to do is put a big burden in front of contributions to MicroProfile, because that's actually been what's been making the project very successful. And the last thing we want to do is ruin that. So, but the key point is that from an individual contributor perspective, somebody who just wants to, first have that first engagement with the MicroProfile community, I don't think any of this changes whatsoever. It really is exactly the same workflow as it is today.
And well, so then let me be a bad advocate here. And how about if we get more?
I have a question too, so
okay, go ahead.
Give other people some room.
Go ahead.
Well, I had next up. Okay, Scott has a question about the worst case scenario that Mike brought up, but also I think Gordon had something as well, and I saw Gordon and Scott kind of chatting in the group. So maybe if you want to tackle those two questions, I guess, yeah. Scott.
Well, let me make a comment first. I mean, the first issue is that the scope of the gap between a specification and an open source project in terms of the IP is a function of the time frame over which the specification cannot be changed. So the canonical worst case example really is coming from long-term specifications, especially if they have a hardware component which is cost prohibitive and time expensive to make a change to avoid the infringement. That's really not the case for open source projects. So we, Red Hat, are debating whether or not that worst case scenario is applicable. And in fact, your example pretty much is addressed in your response, because there are members who are going to have patents that can be used to change the specification in a 3-month window to avoid the infringement. So our view is that this is an unnecessary thing because of the lightweight nature of the MicroProfile process.
+1.
So, I mean, we're going to have Red Hat and Eclipse are going to have a discussion on this point, so they'll all come to some more common agreement on what the exact nature of the risk is. But I mean, that's our position right now, is we feel that that's not really required because of the nature of the MicroProfile project. Gordon was asking about this, how do you know what patents are actually being licensed? And the fact is you don't. I mean, it's really basically an umbrella statement that's only as strong as the scope of the members who are participating. So if there's one member, your patent protection is as strong as that one member.
Yep. That's absolutely true. The patent protections that you get is the sum of the patents that are owned by the companies contributing or participating. One small piece of good news, I guess, in this is that IBM is involved, and last time I checked, they have by far the largest patent portfolio in the world. So at least we got that going for us.
One could imagine a scenario where one could append a MicroProfile config implementation onto some other piece of software, and by implementing the MicroProfile config specification, that company is not then automatically entitled to the entirety of IBM's patent portfolio licensing. That won't pass, I don't think. So.
Well, it depends on how the TCK is constructed. So compatibility is basically defined by the TCK. At least that's how it works in Jakarta. I think that under the Eclipse Foundation specification process, it's up to the project itself to decide what compatible means, within some forms of good taste and reason. But there's nothing that says that you couldn't define compatibility. And of course, this would have to be matched with the wishes of the companies that are licensing patents to the specs. But there's no reason in that scenario where you said where you added config to some other body of work, if that body of work was still still past the TCKs, and if they basically ran the TCKs and said, look, we pass it, we claim this as being compatible, then yeah, you would get all of the patent grants. So you would get you would get a royalty-free license to that implementation on any patent from IBM that reads on that body of work.
But if IBM was earning revenue from a patent because a company was using it to gain some benefit, the company could come up with a feature to add to their software that implemented a MicroProfile config spec. And are you then, it doesn't seem logical to me that they would then be able to save hundreds of thousands of pounds over the next 15 years because they've managed to pass the MicroProfile config TCK in their video conferencing system.
Right. No, the patent grant is restricted to a required patent for any implementation of the spec, not
right.
It can't
be right.
Not the whole portfolio.
Right. So if I patent dogs, you don't get my dog patent on your cat. That is true.
You know, like, let me just say, again, the backup here. I think, you know, from my side, I would not like to change. I would like for MicroProfile not to change anything, but for the reasons that Scott nicely, as always, stated, we have currently no issues. But what I want to say is not that we want to keep the status quo. It's not that. It's that things are changing still with Eclipse and moving with Jakarta. And it is dangerous to even consider moving what currently works. We have like the adaptability of MicroProfile, and I go again with it. It's increasing globally, and it is not because we have a process that is tight and it tells you you cannot do this and that. It's because we're so inclusive, because we don't have titles, there are no leads, everyone has the power to contribute. It depends on the effort of the person. I agree that there are corporations behind all of us, a few of us, but not all of us. Those individuals, they have no employees. They are so valuable because it keeps everyone on it.
All right, sorry. I'm going to step in. I think you're reinforcing your prior point. I'm going to pass this on to Alistair. I'm trying to keep track in the chat, so I apologize if you're not following the chat. So we have Alistair up next, and then I believe Alex.
Okay, so I just wanted to clarify something, Mike. So if I'm working in a specification and that's under the Java APIs are under Apache and the specification document is under Apache. There are patent grants associated with what I put in the document. So let's assume I write a paragraph of text and I have a patent that is covered by that paragraph. I would assume that an independent implementation would be able to implement it because I wrote that paragraph of text. But if, say, John had a patent on that paragraph of text, then there'd be no patent grant for the patent, and John could go and assert patent ownership on the open source alternative implementations that could be under an MIT license. But because we're both under the concept structure of this specification agreement, once it goes final and somebody runs the TCK, they would get John's patent and my patent, even irrespective of who wrote that one paragraph in the spec. Is that right?
That's mostly right, although I would actually argue that the assertion that you made early in that scenario, that if you wrote a paragraph of text that, because you're an employee of IBM, that IBM's patents would cover independent implementations of that text. I actually don't think that's true. Under the Apache license, because the Apache license says that you get you're contributing the royalty-free patents to the work, and creating an independent implementation is a form of derivative work. But because the original contribution is text and the independent implementation is code, I don't think there's any grant of patents that flow through to the independent implementation. But nonetheless, the more important point is that you are correct that under the specification process, both your patents and John's patents would cover independent implementations.
Okay, so if I wrote a Java API that itself encoded a patent, which is probably difficult, then I contribute it. I can't assert because I've granted patent rights. John could, but if you go through the specification process, both John agrees not to, as long as you meet the TCK, and that's how this is materially different from the rights you would get under an open source project, because you get the patent rights for code that wasn't in the original open source project.
Correct.
There must logically be a way to define a set of people who contribute to a spec, because it must not be possible for somebody to implement a more write a more obscure microprofile spec that, for example, I don't contribute to and don't sign off on, and then that somehow grants licenses to patents that come from IBM merely because they are a member of the microprofile community. So
I'm not sure I understood the question, but let me try. I think I might have got it, but I think the point is under the Eclipse Foundation spec process, and this is true of most spec processes, is if IBM chooses to remain a participant in a spec at the moment it goes final, then they are agreeing that any patent that they have is licensed to any independent compatible implementation of that spec.
They may grant a license for any patent which is necessary and obvious to implement the spec, and we have to define which companies are signing up to which specifications in order to create a legal set.
Correct.
Yes, and the process by doing what you just described is called the Eclipse Foundation specification process.
If there's an IBM contributor to that specification.
I think most of this is theoretical, because most of the specs are pretty much straightforward, because we try to do
I apologize, I'm going to insert here, again, a little bit of a time management thing here. So I was in the grant, literally you've got about 3 minutes, Mark, you were on deck anyway, so go ahead, you got about 3 minutes, and then we're going to spend the last 2 minutes of the meeting covering MicroProfile 3. All right, go.
I would love to take a few steps back. The GSPA had the license setup where you kind of get just the rights to read and know about this stuff, and you only get the full license to implement all those things via the TCK. Mostly because there was money involved, which we don't have at Eclipse right now, and this is a good thing. But also because this was kind of a way to legally force vendors to be compatible. There are other ways to force vendors to be compatible, which is the market power. So if we have 10 implementors and 9 of them are compatible with each other, and one says he wants to make some crazy things, those single vendor will not, the users will not be happy. So this vendor will just from the sheer force of the market be forced to be compatible, and that's what we have at MicroProfile. So I'm not quite sure if this heavyweight legal approach to restrict licenses, actually, because under the Apache license you get much more than under the Eclipse Foundation specification license, because you only get the full stack.
I saw that in the chat. That's simply wrong. I know that you think it's true, but I'm sorry, you're just wrong.
In which part?
Saying that the Apache license provides more grants. Well, actually, the Apache license does grant more rights than the Eclipse Foundation specification license. Yes. But it does not grant more rights than the Eclipse Foundation specification process. Because when you add up the EFSL plus the TCK plus the participation agreements, you get many more rights than what you get from just the Apache license.
You get about the same, yeah. That's okay. But you have a kind of also the TCK license, and you need to implement and pass the TCK, and only then you get it. So it's kind of, you split the rights in two different legal documents. Let's say it that way. Is this kind of okay?
The more important is the more important point is that the rights that you get are greater. There's a big difference between the royalty-free patent license in the Apache license versus the ability to have full patent grants of the entire IBM portfolio to independent implementations of the spec. You're comparing apples to watermelons.
I would love to get
and I apologize for interrupting. We're at the time. Time's up. However,
the point is we have a legal way and we have the market power way to ensure compatibility. And the question is whether for MicroProfile the later isn't enough.
I'm pretty sure that I never once talked about ensuring compatibility.
Okay, 2, 1. Okay, so here's, I got it. Hold on. Now, I apologize. I got to be the mean guy here. We're going to continue this discussion in our Google group in a thread. I think what we should do is create a Google Doc with any outstanding questions that need to be answered. Then, Mike, what we could do is kind of provide you a link to the Google Doc, and you can go on and answer them. I think that's the easiest format, maybe.
I'm going to do that directly via the MicroProfile marketing drive, and I will send the document, just saying QA. Or, John, you have access to the document, so just use that. Don't create a private. Just use the MicroProfile marketing drive.
Not sure this is a marketing thing, but
no, it's not a marketing thing, but it is public. Everyone has access. What I don't want to see is the restriction to who gets to us.
There's never a restriction, but okay. So we'll go ahead and do that. Thanks, Mike, and Paul for joining. Really informative. We got about a minute left, and we would like to cover MicroProfile 3. So, Kevin, if you can go ahead and take that away.
Thank you. So, first of all, Mike, thanks for sticking around for the whole hour and not just 30 minutes. Very good discussion. So, just to get everyone up to date on MicroProfile 3.0, if you've been following the Google group, we had a potential hiccup last week, but we were able to work around it with the third-party dependencies, and we got that out. I ended up requesting the release review, and we've already gotten the technology PMC approval and the IP log approval from Wayne. So it looks like we're all set for next Wednesday's release review, and we should be able to be clear with going ahead with our marketing announcement the week after. So thank you very much, and I think we're good with the MP3.0 release.
Congrats.
Thanks.
All right, thanks everyone. I know we had a lot of questions and just not enough time. I apologize for, I had to cut some people off. I had to be the arbiter of time. That's one of my pains in life.
Job.
You did a great job.
I appreciate it. All right. Same bat time, same bat channel in 2 weeks. So thanks everyone.
Bye everyone.
Yep. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.